Hey everyone, it's Jean-A from The Last Stitch. Something that has been top of mind lately is top stitching. Yes, and because I am sewing lots of samples for my upcoming book, Sewing Jeans. Of course, information about that book will be in the description section. And I thought it would be a good idea to share with you my top 8 tips for really nailing top stitching, especially when you're working with heavy thread and also perhaps, contrasting thread when you really want to make sure that your top stitching is top notch. So without further ado, let's start with tip number 1. You definitely need to experiment with your needle thread tension, especially when you're working with heavy top stitching thread like this one. That means that you will probably have to crank it up quite a bit. So for instance, when I made these jeans, I was actually having to go all the way up to almost 9 out of 10. And while my Bernina claims to have auto tension, and that's kind of true, when it comes to using heavy thread on heavy fabric, I definitely need to crank up the tension quite a bit. So if you are having problems with an unbalanced tension, so for instance, in these examples, you can see how the needle thread tension is too loose, so you can see how the loops are forming on the reverse side of the fabric, so that is definitely very common. But a quick fix to do that is just to crank up the tension, do another sample. Remember to make sure that you also are using the same type of fabric and the layers that you're planning to sew, because also increasing the number of fabric layers will also mess a little bit with the tension, so definitely be mindful of that thing. So that's my number 1 tip, is to always increase the tension when you're sewing with heavy top stitching thread. Tip number 2 is to use a top stitching needle instead of a regular heavy needle when you're working with, those thick threads that you're usually doing when you're doing top stitching on denim and stuff like that. And what I use is a top stitching needle from Schmetz. And the main advantage of these type of needles are that they have a much larger eye. So no more, trying to fit all that heavy, thick thread into that tiny needle, because even though the needles can be quite large, the denim needles, for instance, when you're top stitching jeans, they are still quite a bit smaller than the needles of this one. So, and also I think that at least that's what Schmetz claims, and I'm sure other brands do as well, that they are actually constructed in a way so they should do really good work when it comes to top stitching. Is that true or not? I have no idea. But I will say that the result that I'm getting with these top stitching needles are really, really good. So they come up to size 110, size 18. So they are large enough for most fabrics that you will probably sew on a domestic sewing machine. So again, link to this one will be in the description section. Tip number 3. Of course, it's always nice to use a heavy top stitching thread, but sometimes you cannot find the exact same colorway in your compared to your regular sewing machine thread, right? Another issue is perhaps that you might have run out of thread, you don't have it, and you want to top stitch. But luckily, there is actually a quick fix to do that. What you can do is just to take regular spools of thread, and you can wind them up on the bobbin, because you can also, of course, if you like, my machine has two pins, you can, of course, place them both on these sides. But if you don't have that, just stack 2 bobbins on top of your pin, thread them both all the way, and then you have a nice top stitching thread that looks kind of similar to the single one that I showed you just a minute ago. So these are actually amazingly nice looking. And recently I actually did an experiment with where I leveled up and actually used 3 threads. So I stacked three bobbins on top of each other and threaded the machine and used that in the needle. Of course, again, I use the top stitching needles because when you're working with 3 threads in the needle, you definitely need a large eye. But I'm happy to report that the look was actually really cool, kind of almost looks a bit like embroidery thread, if that, that kind of reference makes sense to you. So if you want to be a little bit experimental, especially if you're doing like top stitching on jeans pocket and you want to get almost that kind of hand-sewn look, go crazy with the amount of needle threads. I haven't tried 4, I can imagine, but I'm sure that, again, with the tension settings and all that stuff, you will probably run into some issues when you're working with too many threads in the needle. But 2 and up to 3, no problem. So that's a good idea if you don't have this type of top stitching thread. Tip number 4. Sometimes when you're top stitching over thick layers that are a bit uneven, so for instance, if you're top stitching over the crotch seams like this one, you will probably encounter, that your machine will have problems feeding evenly, and the reason for that is because the presser foot will be leveled. Otherwise, it will be slanted upwards or slanted downwards, which means that it won't properly connect with the feed dogs, and that means that the feeding will not work optimal. But the good thing is that there's a very easy fix for that, and that is to use some type of level tool. This is a Jean-A-Ma-Jig. Hump-Jumper is another word. There are lots of different versions. You will find them pretty much, I think, in every type of shop that caters to sewists. You will find some version of this. Of course, if you have just, some plain piece of plastic that is roughly the same thickness, you don't even need to invest in one of these. I will link to some examples in the description section. And if you don't have a hump jumper, don't worry, you can also just fold the fabric when you are sewing, so you can level the presser foot in that way as well. And sometimes it will be hard to fold the fabric because, it's too bumpy, but you can also just use another piece of fabric instead. So there are lots of different ways of fixing this issue, but definitely always make sure that you have some type of tool that will level your presser foot when you're sewing over uneven layer. That's true for hemming as well. You probably have noticed this already. It's very, very common, and now you know an easy way to fix it. Tip number 5. When you're working with heavy thread, you only use heavy thread in the needle. Trust me on this one. There are definitely exceptions to the rules, but if you want to have a smooth, stress-free top stitching experience, always use regular sewing thread in the bobbin. The reason for that is you will have much less feeding problems, much less tension issues. There are, I know, some sewing machine brands that actually have a special bobbin for heavy thread. I haven't tried that myself, so I cannot give you my honest opinion on it, but there's also ways to adjust the tension on your bobbin. On mine, it's a little screw. I think most have this. You basically adjust the tension of the spring in the bobbin. So if you want to experiment, you can. But there are 2 things you need to keep in mind. The first thing is that because there is probably a good tension setting to start with, especially if your sewing machine has been serviced lately. So you definitely need to mark the spot on the bobbin before you start experimenting, or you might invest in a second bobbin that you can go a little bit crazy with and try different tension settings. But I will say, and I stand by this very strongly, that you will likely not get the same type of result on your regular domestic sewing machine using heavy thread in the bobbin as you would using regular sewing machine thread. So that's just a tip. Take it for what it's worth, but that's my very firm opinion on this topic. Tip number 6. Let's talk about how to get neat, even top stitching. My number 1 recommendation, especially if you're new to top stitching and not struggling, is to use one of these, which is an edge guide presser foot. It has a little bit of a blade or a slot. It looks a bit different, but I would say that most sewing machine brands have this presser foot. Sometimes it's even included in the kit that you get when you buy a machine. And the good thing about this is that you align the blade of the edge of the fabric. So for instance, if you're sewing close to the edge, like an edge stitch, or if you want to sew the first row of top stitching, if you're for instance doing like double rows, you use this for the first row, and then you just align the fabric with the edge and you stitch along it, and it's super, super effective. You'll be amazed on how much better it will look, because especially when you're stitching close to the edge, it's really hard to gauge using a regular presser foot, right? But with edge stitch, that's not even an issue. And then of course, if you're doing a second row, it will be a breeze because you will have this already so nice and even. Tip number 7. You probably noticed this, especially when you're using heavy thread in the needle, that when you're starting to sewing, it's not uncommon to have your bobbin thread and your needle thread to kind of jam up and get a little bit tangled in the start of the stitching sequence, which is super annoying. But luckily, there's actually just 2 small things that you can do to really prevent this. And first of all, that is before you start sewing, make sure that the needle thread and the bobbin thread is pulled back, so you don't have any thread underneath the fabric. Make sure that that's a good habit to have always, but especially it's important when you are using the heavy thread. And the second thing that is also very effective is that you start sewing with the needle down. So what you do is that you just move the needle down using your hand wheel or whatever type of function your machine has for this, and then you start sewing. So these small little things will make a massive difference when it comes to preventing tangled up thread. Tip number 8. When you are securing your heavy top stitching thread, you will notice that you get these really big bumps if you're using the classic method of going back and forth, what you would do when you secure a stitch. But I recommend that you instead try another method if you want to avoid all that bulk and maybe even jammed up thread. And that is to, when you're closing in, usually when you're top stitching, you will have a situation where you can overlap because you're usually stitching 2 parallel rows, or you're stitching around the area. Especially those, but even if you're just securing a single row, just decrease the stitch length and then you stitch for, a couple of centimeters, maybe centimeters, half an inch, and then you stop. And this will usually be enough. Definitely try out that and see if it works for you. I find it very, very efficient. So nowadays, I don't actually backstitch much when I'm using heavy top stitching thread. Instead, I rely on this method by just decreasing the stitch length. And if you want to learn more about jeans making videos, I highly recommend that you check out my playlist, which I have created for you. Links will also be in the description section, and I have lots of other information on top stitching, how to sew straight, and other tips. Thank you so much for watching, stitch safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!